Welcome, everyone. My name is Michelle Deutschman, and I'm the Executive Director of the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. I am thrilled that you could join us today for our second Fellows in the Field workshop, Sex.Talk.Toolkit. Today, we have the privilege to talk with Shira Tarrant, a professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at California State University, Long Beach, where she engages students in her research on gender and sexual politics. Dr. Tarrant is the author and editor of several books, including The Pornography Industry, What Everyone Needs to Know, Men and Feminism, and Gender, Sex, and Politics. Her work has been reviewed in The New Yorker and The Atlantic. Her commentary has appeared in global and local media, including Forbes, Ms. Magazine, Huffington Post, and others. Shira received her PhD in political science from UCLA. And I'm proud to share that the reason I have the privilege of knowing Shira is that she recently completed a fellowship with the center, during which she designed a digital toolkit to provide resources for effectively teaching foundational issues about sexual politics, public policy, and social norms. The link to the toolkit, along with the full recording of today's session, will be included in the recap email that we will send out early next week. The chat and Q&A functions are all available, so please feel free to participate in the session by posing questions and comments throughout our time together. So before I turn it over to Shira to take us on a tour of her toolkit, I want to spend a couple minutes asking her about how this toolkit came to be. So, hi, Shira. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd love for you just to start by telling us what inspired you to create this toolkit and why did you think there was a need for it?
Good question. Okay, so starting with the fact that I'm a political scientist and I also teach in gender studies and sexuality studies, I put the two together in my scholarship and in my teaching and focus on sexual politics. And one of the things that I've been noticing, it's sort of been increasing in occurrence and in my concern, is that in classrooms with my university students, there is self-censorship happening, where students are silencing themselves before they speak about sexual politics or sexuality or gender issues. There is also cancel culture that is migrating from social media into classrooms, and that further interrupts the opportunities for free speech and really robust engagement. And so based on that concern and some other concerns as well, I wanted to create this toolkit that provided opportunities for students to engage with questions that are so deeply personal, but also very, very political, and in the best of settings can be really challenging to talk about.
I was just going to say that I think, it's already hard to talk about these issues, and then you add these other layers of self-censorship and cancel culture. You've always made a point of emphasizing the importance of data-driven dialogue, and that's a key in your toolkit. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and why that was so important to you?
Sure. So one thing I want to clarify is when I say data-driven dialogue with my toolkit, I'm not throwing tons of data, tons of statistics. I'm being really selective in the amount of data that I'm presenting so that it's sort of digestible for students. But one other observation that I've been making, I've been teaching sexual politics for 20 years. And one of the things that I've been noticing is students coming into the room sharing personal anecdote, personal identity, personal experience, and all of that is really legitimate and important, but it's not a substitute for having information. And so I saw this as an opportunity to kind of shift that framing to provide information and teach students how to engage with data and integrate that into their own personal experience as well, but not to substitute personal experience for information, especially around issues of sexuality where often there's so little information to be had in the first place.
So you see them as complements to one another.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, 20 years is a long time to be teaching this. I'd be interested another time to hear about how it's all changed. But speaking of changes, even in the year that you started and finished your fellowship, so much changed. And I'm curious how that altered, if at all, your plans. Was it always going to be digital? Did you have to kind of switch because of COVID?
Okay, so what changed? Title IX was in flux, and so clearly this needed to be part of my toolkit. But I was like, when is the decision coming? What's happening? So that was one thing. The other thing is COVID. So it was always going to be a digital toolkit, and if I could just share one of my personal experiences which was a conversation with you. Once I got into the project, I thought, oh my God, what did I promise with a digital toolkit? Like, what am I thinking? And I asked Michelle if I could write a book instead. And she's like, no, it's a digital toolkit, which is fair. So I wanted it accessible. And this was a new project for me. I've written books, but it turned out to be challenging in new ways, and I had to stretch and grow in that regard. But I want it to be easy to click the link and send, or to click the link and use in a classroom, in a way that complements obviously texts and books and things like that. But this was new. COVID changed the structure of it, because partway through, when our campus went on remote and everybody went on lockdown, I had to do a really quick pivot and think about what it would mean not only to present information online in a digestible structure, but online with potentially students and faculty who are never meeting face-to-face, talking about potentially really sensitive or fraught topics. And so that impacted the structure. And I think actually for the better, not COVID being for the better, but the structure of obviously. So it's very streamlined. And you'll see that when I take everyone through the quick tour.
And I'm going to let you do that in a minute, but I do just want to mention that I want to be clear that I'm still encouraging Shira to write the book. I just wanted her to write the book after she did the digital toolkit. So hopefully that's something we can all look forward to. I think my last question before we go to the tour is, there's so many topics that fall within kind of the rubric of sexual politics. How did you decide which ones to highlight?
Good question. And that was really tough. And so for months and months, my whole office was covered in like bulletin boards with little Post-its that I was rearranging in pull down tabs, and, big themes and smaller themes. And so in the end, I accepted the fact that one toolkit can't be all things to all people, and that I wanted to do a few key things and do those well. And I also set aside issues of gender, because gender politics often, for obvious reasons, gets melded with sexual politics. But I really did my best to leave gender issues. Gender infuses the toolkit, but gender debates or policy debates largely left to the side, just in the interest of meeting the goal of this particular project.
No, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So without further ado, I'm going to let Shira share her screen and take us on a tour. And again, I want to encourage people, we would like these workshops to be interactive, to please put questions in either the Q&A or the chat.
Okay. So here's the screen. Here's the toolkit. And starting with the landing page, I'm going to mention why this is significant, because if someone's in a classroom or a virtual classroom and teaching, I don't know that you want to talk or have discussion with the actual content. And so this was very intentional to have a landing page where you could always click over to a sort of neutral moment while conversation develops. This is the overview, who we are. I worked with a research assistant who just graduated and this fall started a PhD program. And she was really helpful, not only in being so organized, but sort of the voice of, speaking on behalf of undergraduates, how this would land with students. Was very helpful to work with a student. So, Michelle, this is sort of to your question about how I organized it. I'm going to get back to the wheel of questions, but there are three general overviews: pleasure, consent, and safety. a lot of the pull down tabs rotated, because you could put, depending on your politics and things like that, consent could go under pleasure, consent could go under safety. I decided to put consent 101 and consent ethics and affirmative consent under its own tab, because a lot of times it gets folded into safety, like alarm, like red alert, did you consent? I want to back up a little bit to some feedback I got from other students as well, in sort of not really focus groups, but sort of workshops with students to say, what would you want to see? Where are you at with what you're hearing and learning and talking about in class? And one theme that I kept hearing was that when it comes to sexual politics, college students are getting a lot of Title IX stuff, not really information, but the quizzes that they need to complete to continue on as a student. And those aren't really actually open conversations about consent, about Title IX. And when it comes down to it, there's really, really a need for and room for much broader conversations about consent that go beyond just Title IX do's and don'ts. And when it comes to Title IX, and this is an option in the toolkit, it turns out that when I talk with students, they've all gotten the Title IX test that they need to take from the administration, but they don't necessarily know where to go on campus or who they would talk to. And so there's a disconnect. Even if campuses think that they're sharing that information, the students are not hearing it and wouldn't know where to tell a friend to go for help. So based on that kind of feedback, this took shape. I want to just briefly focus on two examples. So each of these pull downs has the same format. Each of them has an activity, a resource, and data. And the data points always have 5. They're bullet points. And so this is what I meant when I said I'm not throwing a lot of spaghetti at the wall with this, but like 5 points. And this can be used as a starting place. It could be used as a standalone. There are all kinds of multimedia resources, and the activities are really designed with distance learning in mind. They can also be incorporated into in-person easily. And they're also designed to facilitate conversation, like I said, around conversations that are personal or could feel embarrassing or get hijacked by people who are really comfortable talking about their own personal experience, and then other students don't want to talk. So by offering a resource, the activity and the discussion refers to the resource, and it refers to the data as opposed to students' own personal experience. I'll give you one more example of what this looks like. And this is a lot more personal, where it's the suggested activity is personal journaling, but it's based on the basics of consent and the controversies around consent, because even though yes means yes is that's the push right now, and that's the sort of party line. There are questions about whether yes means yes makes sense in interpersonal sexual encounters, whether it makes sense in terms of a legal standard. And one of my concerns that motivated the toolkit is when people feel like they need to toe a party line, like yes means yes, then it shuts down conversations or even questions that students might have about whether that is the best standard or the best level of engagement or style of engagement. So you get the gist of it. There are additional resources, community-based resources, multimedia resources, and also a glossary where, it's not hard to Google definitions, but I wanted to make it really quick and easy for students or faculty to click over to the glossary. This is designed for faculty who are working with these issues already, but I really wanted to make it accessible for faculty who are sort of outside the bubble, who are not experts in sexual politics, but want to branch out or have students who ask them questions. So this is the last thing on my tour. and we're going to give it a spin. This can be used in a couple different ways. Students can use the wheel to ask themselves questions. They could interview their friends. They could have breakout sessions if you're doing Zoom classes. I have one student who's actually a student zooming in from Spain, and she was assigned the wheel of questions in another class, not mine. And she said she took it outside the classroom and shared it with her mother and her sister, and it got conversations going, which is, to me, just the happiest moment, because that's what I would love to hear. So you click, you spin, it's like Wheel of Fortune, and there are, all these questions that come up randomly. And here's one example. How do you personally know someone is giving consent? And I'm actually so glad that this one randomly came up, because this was an issue that came up with the student focus groups, where the question came up, how do you know that someone is giving you consent, and also how do you give consent? Right. And this is an example of what I mean about taking the issue of consent beyond the Title IX do's and don'ts that are established by the administration and by federal law and, that kind of thing, to really open up conversation or thoughtful self-reflection about what does consent look like, sound like, how do people express it? I'll just do one more to see just to give you an example, and then. Are there sex topics that you can't discuss in class? Right? And that could be a really great conversation starter if people are feeling silenced or self-silenced. So again, this is an example of how the toolkit is designed with both free speech, open dialogue, and data in mind. So I'm going to stop the share screen there. And
I could do that wheel of questions all day.
I
think one of the questions, if you don't mind, Shira, is, since you've been doing this for so long, can you share some examples of some of the challenges that you have faced, over the years, especially as of late, in facilitating these discussions, just generally, and then maybe how you think the toolkit will help?
Yeah. So this is, I'm experiencing this in classrooms, but, this is part of the broader culture as well, where there is this very bifurcated political climate we're living in, which I don't have to explain to anybody. And the way this is playing out in terms of sexual politics is that there's, this impulse to toe a party line. And that is happening on the political left and the political right. So I have students who are really hewing to a sort of radical, so-called radical purity politics. Like, are you woke enough? A sort of woke Olympics. And that becomes its own challenge, along with students who have maybe gone through high school programs and family settings where they haven't gotten information. And you would think that with Google and all of that and, social media, that people would be up to speed on their own, but they're not. And so those two things collide, and I've been observing them getting more intense more recently.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when you did the focus groups this spring, is there anything else that sort of came up in terms of what students were sharing with you, either about what they are talking about or what they're not talking about?
A lot of students reported that a lot of students shared that they were afraid to speak up in class because they were afraid that somebody else would clap back. And it's different from feeling scared to talk because their question might be dumb, that kind of, along the lines of there are no dumb questions. It's something different. And students shared that repeatedly, that they're afraid of someone who's sort of more woke than them clapping back and shaming them, really, for having an honest question. And I think, unfortunately, some of that modeling is coming from within feminist communities, where there's one party line and that's the feminist politics that's being taught, and that starts to infuse even feminist classrooms. I think that that's really important to mention as well.
And would you say that in the last 5 years, you've seen this increase like significantly in terms of self-censoring and fear of the sort of, like you said, clapback, like it's going up like this, or is it really more like a undulating?
Yeah, it's intense. It seems very intense. And the other thing that I want to mention along those lines is that aside from the student focus groups, I routinely have students in my office. I mean, not now, I'm distance teaching, but students sharing with me one-on-one, hey, I had a question. I really didn't want to ask it because that person in that seat always harshes on students, but here's my question. So from where I sit, I'm hearing that kind of thing. I'm seeing a pattern, I'm hearing it repeatedly, and I'm seeing, to answer your question, a real spike in the occurrence.
And then if you don't mind me continuing to like ask, but do you find that there's any trend in terms of who is coming to your office who's self-censoring in terms of gender or sexual orientation, or is it really like people all over the map with all different experiences in, these fields and otherwise?
It's really all over the map. It really is. I'll give you one example. I have a student who's taken a couple classes with me who is about to graduate with an engineering degree and doesn't, in the classes that they take in their major, they're not debating or discussing a lot of things. They're not like digging into the issues. And so a class like mine or in our department is refreshing. We've maintained ongoing emails, even though they're not taking a class from me now, about these kinds of things, and feeling unable to speak up in certain circles or in certain classrooms around these issues. So that's coming from the engineering major, right? And then I have students from within our own major, WGSS, who are feeling that. So across the board. And again, I think that it maps on what's happening in social media. It maps on what's happening in electoral politics and how we dialogue. So I'm hoping that all of that will ease up soon.
I think many people would echo that hope. COVID is definitely a really interesting time when it comes to, sexual politics and safety. And I don't know if you've had students sort of inquire about those types of issues of sort of in this virtual world and safety world. And, if that's come up or not quite yet.
Not quite yet. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. To bring it back to the toolkit as one example, there's the pull down on hooking up or hookup culture.
That's what I was thinking of.
Yeah. And so on the one hand, it's like, well, here we are, we're supposed to be socially distant, so no hooking up. Well, maybe not. But, if it was hard to talk about before, because people are supposed to be distancing, that could really put a further damper on open conversation about what is and is not happening in hookup culture or actual hookups. The other thing is, though, that if people are social distancing and not hooking up, which I'm not holding my breath on that, but let's just say people are, they're not living in dorms at the same rate, not at parties at the same rate, et cetera. What a great opportunity to have a sort of big pause and some distance from the pressures of hookup culture to be able to sit and pause and reflect and discuss without thinking about the party that's happening on Friday night. So I'm not really sure, though, what's happening with students in their own personal relation to some of these issues, because they're not quite sharing that with me yet. And I'm expecting I'll be hearing soon. So.
Okay, we did get our first question in the queue. We'll take a look at it. I'll read it. It says, this week, 2 Ohio legislators demanded that Kent State University ban pornography because a textbook about anime discussed books with themes of sexual violence. Considering the recent attacks on critical race theory, do you think there will be similar efforts to censor discussions of sexuality on campuses? So kind of this is looking forward. I guess, are you surprised to hear that universities are still banning pornography? And do you think maybe that this is a new trend? or an old new trend?
An old new trend. John, thank you so much for that question, because I was not aware that happened. And I grew up in Cleveland, so, my eye is on Ohio always. It's not new. There have always been accusations of pornography, including, a couple years back, a professor who showed a documentary that's very critical of pornography, very anti-pornography, and had students accuse her of, foisting pornographic material on them. So that's why pornography and sexual politics is so important, because it is at ground zero for free speech issues and can easily be hijacked. I think that, it's anyone's guess about, whether this will increase. I don't want to do trend forecasting, but it has been a problem, and I expect that it would be a continued problem and something to keep an eye on. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because after this, I will be checking out what's happening at Kent State.
I guess one of my other questions is, so much work went into this toolkit. And do you sort of see it as a living resource that will change as society changes? And right, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I very much had that in mind creating it, that, I could click, have something go live, and next week it could change. The political landscape could change. So because, this is one advantage of having something online as opposed to a book, is that it can be updated regularly as needed. Other plans in the works are, I would like to expand the wheel of questions and create cards that could be used, and then I could have more questions that are incorporated. And I had a request from the student I mentioned who is in Spain and unable to actually attend in person because of the pandemic. But she said it would be amazing if the toolkit could be translated into Spanish. So
That's amazing. I was thinking how if I had more free time, it'd be fun to be your research assistant doing the updates for this toolkit. So I just want to make sure people know that you can actively ask some questions to share in the chat. We have another sort of tough question that I don't know, Shira, if you're ready to comment on. I know that the center isn't necessarily ready to comment on it, having to do with the recent executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. And there's just a lot of concerns about how this will result in censorship and chilling of speech. And Davidian is asking if you have any thoughts about how this might limit professors or others who are doing sexual health education.
So I'm reading the question as you're describing this. I don't really feel prepared to address this. I wish we had dialogue happening, because I would love to hear more about the concerns about power differentials. Maybe we could connect after the workshop, because I'd love to talk about that one-on-one for sure.
Yeah, I want to encourage, I'm assuming that you're fine with this, but we will be sharing Shira's email. And I think the same way that it happens in class, I would love for everybody to feel comfortable asking questions through the chat. But if you don't, then I really hope that people will use the opportunity to reach out to Shira to discuss more. Let's see. One more question coming in about Title IX. It just says, about Title IX, given your experience in the varieties of sexual experience, is it plausible that one Title IX investigator's judgment about an interaction should be treated as objectively correct, upon which an administrative decision can be made? I guess this question has to do with if you're a Title IX investigator, relative versus individual sort of sexual judgments. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. I think it certainly seems hard to be objective in the realm of sexuality.
Definitely hard to be objective. Robert, thank you for this question. I get the sense that there's a lot of backstory to this question, and, I'd be interested in hearing about that. I'm going to file this under also not prepared to address this particular question right now, because I feel like it's a bigger conversation that I would love to have, maybe a one-on-one. But I will say this. When I was doing the Title IX section of the toolkit, there are so many things that I personally want to say about Title IX and the shortcomings in how it is implemented on campuses. And that seemed to go beyond what would be valuable for students who understand a lot less about Title IX than administrations might think. Understand a lot less about how federal law works or what Title IX is intended, that it's anti-discrimination law. So starting with that, I don't know if this will answer your question, but I will say this. I take issue with how Title IX is implemented on many campuses because of the lack of transparency and because of the discretionary power that very few people hold in making the decisions, and the ways in which their own personal perspective, their own campus politics, and things like that can come to bear. Title IX is definitely an area where towing the party line has surfaced. And I wrote about this for Playboy last summer, addressing it, saying things that may not be popular among Title IX cohorts on campuses, things that may not be popular among feminist cohorts, but are really important to investigate. So I don't know if that gets obliquely at your question, but maybe we could continue later.
Well, I was actually going to say, since you raised it, Shira, if it would be okay in the follow-up email to circulate a link to the Playboy article, because I thought it was really interesting and important read, and I'd like to include that if you're okay with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I have to say, as someone who has the opportunity to work with these incredible fellows, I have the opportunity to learn so much from them. And I've learned so much from you, Shira, especially about a topic that, I'll be honest, I'm not always comfortable talking about. So you've really inspired me. And I think that the toolkit, I hope, will inspire other people to take on conversations that they might not already do. And unless, Shira, you have a couple other thoughts, anything else you want to share with folks, I'm going to give people one last chance to jump in, but just, any final words about the toolkit and how you're hoping that it will be utilized, or any last words about, sexual politics and the state of the world. I'm joking.
No, you know what? I've covered everything that I wanted to. I'm definitely available for questions later. I see that another question just
came. Why don't you do that one from Brooklyn?
Okay, let's see. How much are you observing actually a new phenomenon is what you're observing about self-censorship amplified, but has always been a part of how young adults talk about sexual politics. And I would add to that old adults, not only young adults, but older adults talk about sexual politics. So Brooklyn, really good question. Thank you. I don't think this is brand new. It's not brand new, but it is, given the broader political climate right now, it's amplified and it's intensified. And there's so much at stake right now, not only in regard to sexual politics, but free speech and how we engage with each other around conversations that are deeply, deeply personal, have to do with identity, and also have to do with large-scale policy and large-scale politics and scientific health medical information, right? So definitely not new, but definitely exacerbated and intensified more recently.
Do you think that intensification is in part because of social media?
I don't think they can be uncoupled.
Separated.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm going to let you do some final words, Shira, before I wrap it up and share what our next workshop will be.
Thanks. I think I've covered everything. I just want to thank you again for the fellowship opportunity and for this workshop opportunity. If anybody has questions, if you're going through the toolkit later and questions pop up, please feel free to reach out and I'm happy to connect. So I'll just leave it there.
Okay. And I, of course, want to thank Shira and thank all of you that joined us today. And I hope you'll take her up on that offer. I want to just let people know we have 2 additional Fellows in the Field workshops that are coming up. One is one that we are doing jointly with NASPA. on October 14th that has some of the peers from Shira's cohort talking about balancing acts and issues about speech and student affairs. And then we have one coming up at the end of the month on student activism. And you will be getting an email about that. So with that, I'll just give you back your 23 minutes and thanks, Shira, again, and thank all of you and say, see you soon.